right, I think we'll get started. So welcome to the last Cambridge Disaster Research Network seminar of the term. We're so excited to have you here. I'm Ellen Kujawa, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Geography here at the University of Cambridge. Today, we're looking forward to highlighting the topic of islands in disasters with two great speakers. Islands, especially small islands, face a particular set of disaster risk management challenges and vulnerabilities, and they've been discussed at length, especially in the context of climate change. They also come with unique strengths and opportunities for both resilience and the production of knowledge. Today, we invite two island studies experts, Dr. Geoff Main from the University of Exeter and Dr. Liam Saddington from the University of Cambridge, to present some of their work on islandness and disaster. A note on how things will go today. Dr. Main will present first, followed by Dr. Saddington, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions to the speakers at the end. So please do save your questions till then, and I'll moderate that Q&A period later on. You can also put questions in the chat in the meantime if you have something burning a hole in your brain you just have to get out. With that, Dr. Main, would you like to cue up your slides and begin?
I suppose the first thing to say is, coming from Cornwall, a very happy St. Piran's Day to everyone, but perhaps more importantly, thanks for the Cambridge Disaster Research Network for hosting this session on islands and disasters, and for actually inviting me to talk as part of it. What I'm going to do in my part of this session, really, is to pose two questions and really offer my own thoughts and reflections on islands and disasters, with a little bit of my own work thrown in just for good measure. So the first, are small islands vulnerable to disaster, resilient, or a combination of the two? And the second, in the context of small islands in particular, what islands are we actually interested in? So if we think about islands to begin with, we may have come across them in popular culture, in film, TV, radio, books, including, of course, the famous Robinson Crusoe. But throughout these popular imaginings, they're seen as being exposed, as risky, fragile, as limited. In other words, vulnerable. And this carries on into geographical discussions of islands, with the early suggestions that their societies are cursed by the restricted space, that they're simply too small to protect their society from the risk of destruction. This is also seen in the context of the insularity of islands, with the Royal's 2001 work, A Geography of Islands, again using connotations of vulnerable. So are they vulnerable, resilient, or a combination? Well, within the academic literature, of which there's a long history, islands have long been recognised as having high levels of vulnerability, owing to a multitude and often complex interplay of various factors in relation to disaster risk. If we take just the physical angle, the proneness, susceptibility, and exposure a little bit further, we can identify that the disaster risk landscape of islands is shaped by several key features. For instance, many small island states are located in the tropics, prime for impact from cyclones. Many are located in geophysically vulnerable areas, prone to earthquake or volcanic activity. And many, though not all, typically low-lying, at sea level, and certainly with a 360-degree coastal perimeter. But hang on. As physical entities, they may not be more physically vulnerable to hazards than anywhere else. For islands, then, it's the proportional impacts upon them, on their population, economy, that may be a more accurate representation of their vulnerability. Tropical cyclones, for example, can miss islands altogether or cause relatively minor impact before proceeding to cause catastrophic impact to continental countries. A great example was this hurricane event in 2022. So Hurricane Ian was considered to have brushed some of the Caribbean small islands, caused some minor damage in the Caymans, before cutting across western Cuba, with the storm surge bringing seawater some 2 kilometers inland, to floodwater heights up to 1.5 meters. But that all faded into comparison when Ian made landfall in Florida, where it dumped a tremendous amount of rain, with one area seeing over 760 millimeters, a factor possibly exacerbated by climate change. A storm surge that broke the tidal gauge of the National Hurricane Center, and just shy of 160 fatalities, most of those from the state of Florida. For islands, then, the disaster impacts tend to show two trends. The first is that the highest relative losses are suffered by small islands, usually in response to a single large catastrophe. And we can see this in the context of cyclone events in the Cook Islands, with the losses typically in response to a single catastrophe events. But many, including the 1997 Cyclone Martin, are remembered to this day, a form of local knowledge that's vital for disaster risk reduction. The second, that for some of the larger islands that may have relatively unstable economies and weak political and institutional development, can suffer heavy losses from repeated disaster shocks. This is perhaps best illustrated with the Haitian earthquakes in 2010 and 2021. Reference, of course, the island's colonial history and history of national debt, only serving to exacerbate the impact from both events. But what about resilience? Because evidence suggests that communities living in disaster-prone places, including islands, are able to survive and prosper in the face of potentially disastrous events, by and large because of some of the same characteristics that make them vulnerable. Why? The diverse capacities that individuals and communities hold. In particular, the role of culture in dealing with disasters has been extensively documented in both affluent and less affluent countries, being a key part of a community's livelihood and shaping concerns and behaviour in times of disaster. And this factor of small-sized isolation that we see in the context of vulnerability are also recognised as capacities of island communities, contributing to a spirit of solidarity and sense of community, bringing in this important concept of social capital. But perhaps one of the best examples of culture and local knowledge saving lives in an island disaster comes from an island in Indonesia, known as the Miracle Island, from the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. Now, the reason for such low loss of life, despite the significant damage, their stories and songs passed through the generations of the smong, an onomatopoeic word that encompasses an earthquake and tsunami, with the style and language of one of the more mournful songs, instilling local knowledge of both the event and of actions to take to survive. And within many cultures, islands included, faith is recognised as central to community life, whether a version of Christianity, as here, or traditional beliefs involving magic, animalism, or mysticism. So the answer to our first question, a combination. Islands and their communities can be considered both as vulnerable, but simultaneously resilient, as arguably we all are in the face of wounding events. But when I think about islands and disasters, I'd encourage us to take a step back. What islands are we thinking about? As my students tend to do when faced with a question like this, let's start by looking at definitions. Going to a trusted English dictionary gives us a definition of, quote, a piece of land surrounded by water, smaller than a continent, larger than a rock. Larger than a rock. How big a rock are we talking? For example, this is Bishop Rock in the westernmost Isles of Scilly, some 45 kilometres off the southwestern tip of the Cornish Peninsula. According to the 2008 Guinness Book of World Records, it's the smallest island on Earth to host a building, at 45 metres long and 60 metres wide. Is that larger than a rock? If we look at other definitions, we have a clear size restriction. But even the 2007 classification means that Greenland, considered by some to be the world's largest island, wouldn't be considered an island at all. And most of these definitions suggest a hard-edged boundary. But in the contemporary neoliberal globalized world, do such hard boundaries even exist? And are all islands the same? The simple answer, perhaps, is no. Because even within island regions such as the Caribbean, each island is different physically, socially, politically, culturally. There is no singular Caribbean island. But within reports, policy, and quite often literature, attention remains on SIDS, or small island developing states. But islands, regardless of their level of development, share the same or at least similar characteristics that can make them vulnerable. Now, I do want to emphasise that some attention is turned to consider islands in the context of hazard and disaster at varying stages of development. These are still largely fixed on examples where hazards are frequent and where societies develop diverse coping and management strategies. For instance, Sicily and the eruption of Mount Etna. Here, the frequency of emissions of tephra are frequent enough that the population is used to the volcano's fiery temper. As they are in Iceland, the hazards of atmosphere, land, and subsurface. And because of this frequency, the stakeholder bodies have established effective mitigation, disaster risk reduction, and preparedness efforts across all sectors of society. But what about island states that are small, highly urbanized, and developed, and where hazards are infrequent, but could be particularly devastating as a result? So in this final section of my talk for this afternoon, I want to introduce some of my own research work in just this area, where I, together with some of my colleagues, explored such a question in an island state in the Mediterranean, the Republic of Malta. In geography and island studies, we're regularly using concepts such as the island city or urban island, with New York City a well-known city on an island. But even with cases like Venice, presented by many as the quintessential island city, focus is on the geographies of the island or individual spatial components, whether the city, the island, or the state. But to understand small, highly urbanized, advanced, sovereign island states, we have to understand interconnections between city, state, and the ways in which they are embedded in the island. So as our case study, the Republic of Malta has been considered to be an island city, island state, and city-state, with some recent classifications reflecting work in the 1970s, by identifying that the whole country is now but a single urban area. But this still misses the complex interplay of the spatial components on such a developed island state. Because historically, Malta was made up of many towns and cities that were individually very distinctive, often surrounded by walled fortifications or the countryside, what Baldacchino's referred to as city islands. But over time, these individual city islands have coalesced, and we've now got a situation where Malta may be characterised as a single urban zone, with all the characteristics of a large and expanding urban mass, which operates as a single city. In fact, the island nation is the most concreted over country in Europe, and the most built-up EU member state. So we use the concept of the city island state as means of analysing and considering the facets of this and other similar island nations that can be considered a single urban zone. So rather than maintaining island as our focus, we bring in the critical importance of an interconnected approach, embedding the geographies of city and state with those of the island. Referring to today's topic in this context, we explore the potential for wounding and recognise that it is the complex scalar interconnectivity between city, island, and state that for island nations such as Malta that work together in producing vulnerability and a proclivity to wounding. And in 2022, we took this further and considered in detail the nature of the wounding for this city island state. Because traditionally, Malta is viewed as being low hazard, and that's despite its complex setting in the central Mediterranean. But part of this was due to a lack of long historical records. Whilst there are some, even official records and listings have shortcomings, with concerns raised by the European Union in 2016 over the absence of multi-hazard and cross-border risks in the classified 2015 National Risk Assessment. So we recognise a need for a comprehensive multi-hazard historical catalogue. And so we thought, okay, let's produce one. And we did. So we analysed over 3,000 documents and found that the majority of our source material and evidence had a high degree of reliability. So what we refer to as a definite or confirmed event. For the first time, we've identified events from the Miocene to the end of February 2019, mainly because that's when our funding ran out. We've identified at least 1,527 events, causing at least 661 fatalities, most of those from one event. Now, it's critical to say that these are only minimum counts, as it's highly unlikely that we'll ever know the true count. But importantly, not one part of Malta is unexposed to a natural hazard. And as we see in our 2018 paper, it's only because of the probabilistic nature of extreme events impacting vulnerable people that they've not been more severely affected in recent years. You can read more about all of this in some of our published work in open access in area and natural hazards. And thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. And once more, a very happy St. Piran's Day.
Thank you so much, Geoff. That was fascinating, particularly the time horizon of your work. Liam, would you like to queue up your slides?
Wonderful. Okay, hopefully you should be able to see my slides. Wonderful. Thank you, Geoff. That was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. I have questions myself. So I'm going to be thinking today about low-lying islands, climate change, and disasters. Now, when Rory asked me if I'd like to talk, quite a while ago now, my initial response was, well, I'm not sure I really work on disasters. I work on issues around climate change and islands. And disasters have always been there. They're always in the transcripts of the interviews, the policy documents that you've analysed, but it hasn't been a central focus of my research. So actually, in putting together this talk, I've really enjoyed going back over old papers, old notes, old reflections. And actually, what I've realised is disasters were central to quite a lot of the research that I'd looked at, but just not something I'd teased out before. So today I'm going to be speaking in particular about low-lying island states. So looking at atoll states, places like Kiribati, Tuvalu, that the entirety of their territory consists of low-lying atolls. So the photograph that you can see is taken from a drone, a project I was on in Tuvalu back in 2019. And I think this image kind of really encapsulates why islands have become emblematic of the climate crisis, and in particular low-lying atolls. That when we think about forecasts of anthropogenic increases in temperature and sea level rise, the sea level rises, the low-lying island is inundated, it becomes a shorthand for what the climate crisis might mean for future human, non-human relations, in questions of environmental governance, politics, and justice. But of course, it is actually more complex than this. The sinking island as a shorthand doesn't capture the complexity of what is going on around how the changing environment is affecting low-lying islands. That actually, globally, atolls are pretty stable in terms of their landmass size. What we are seeing is that the islands that make up atolls are changing in form, they are changing in shape, they're moving along the reef platform, but actually today they've more or less kept up with sea level rise. Now that shifting morphology of the island raises issues for habitation, for infrastructure. That isn't to say that life for island communities will be easy with anthropogenic climate change. But the sinking island, the disappearing island, this space of climate refugees, of those displaced by environmental issues, is too simplistic, right? As I'm sure many people on this call will be familiar, you know, the term climate refugee actually doesn't have any grounding in international law. This is something that is resisted by islanders and island states, that actually if you're displaced by an environmental issue, currently you're not afforded protection under international systems. So before I dive into kind of too much of a reflection, I want to just situate where I'm speaking about today. So I'm drawing on my research in the South Pacific, particularly around Tuvalu and Kiribati. So Kiribati is a small island state of just over 30 islands, a population of over 100,000, spread across the Central Pacific. Tuvalu is a smaller island state with a population of around 11,000 or so, scattered across 9 islands. And what I want to propose to you today is that when we're thinking about climate change and sea level rise and low-lying atolls, there have been 3 key disaster discourses that have emerged. So the first is viewing disasters as an existential threat. So as Geoff so well explained in the first talk, that when we're thinking about the vulnerability, the low-lying nature of atolls is presented as an inescapable physical vulnerability, and thus disasters such as tropical cyclones and storm surges can pose an existential threat to the state. The second is thinking about disasters as a way in which climate change is made visible. We might think about climate change as slow, as incremental. We might think about scholarship by people such as Rob Nixon and work on slow violence. But actually, what I found is that for low-lying island states, disasters can become a shorthand for communicating climate change and for making visible what those impacts might be. And the last point I want to highlight is viewing disasters and climate change as a barrier to development, right? So this kind of opposition to seeing climate change and disasters as an existential threat to low-lying island states, but instead as a barrier to economic development. So to start with this idea of existential threat. So with sea level rise for atoll states, as I said, this imaginary of the sinking island is really, really powerful and really pertinent, but doesn't actually capture what is happening on the ground. And what we've seen is recent meteorological hazards, such as Tropical Cyclone Pam in 2015, have been presented as evidence of the future threat to come. So Pam in 2015 affected over half of the population of Tuvalu and caused an estimated 14 million Australian dollars in damage. And when we speak to Tuvaluans, both in policy and on the ground, Pam is very much presented as a consequence of climate change, as something that is going to be replicated in time to come. And following Pam, there has been a real growing sentiment on focusing on hard engineering protective measures, of thinking about things like land reclamation in order to secure the Tuvaluan state against future disasters. Urina and Takimoto have called this a kind of seawall mindset, seeking to fix the atoll's edge to block the intrusion of the sea. Now, you'll recall that I was speaking about the kind of dynamic geomorphology of the atolls, right? That actually these are quite dynamic landforms. And of course, these hard engineering measures seek to fix islands in place. And I want to draw on quotes from interviews that I've done to really give space and voice to Tuvaluans and to the Kiribati, who I've worked with through my research. So this quote comes from a representative of the Tuvaluan government in kind of opposition, in resistance to the idea that it's sea level rise alone, which is the existential threat. So this representative said, well, the terminology is wrong to start off with. We're not likely to be, we are not sinking, we're likely to be inundated. If you look at the trends over a long period of time, of all the data we have, there has been a rise in sea level, but it's certainly not threatening at this stage. So I've been quite careful about using the terminology, because I think the biggest threat to Tuvalu is the whole storm surge or overtopping issue. So here, what is presented as an existential threat, and this is more commonly from engaging with policymakers, is not the slow increment of sea level rise, but of a storm surge from something like Tropical Cyclone Pam when sea levels are elevated. That, as one climate consultant said to me, if we see a high tide coinciding with the right period of the El Nino cycle with a storm surge, this could lead to the devastation of the entire country. So seeing disasters such as storm surges as an existential threat, displacing this slow incremental increase of sea level rise. The second discourse that I want to discuss with you is around disasters and climate visibility. We know from scholarship, from academics like Mike Hume, that things like the 1.5 degree target, that these abstract global forms of knowledge can feel really detached from the everyday. And what I've found kind of going through my research is that actually what's clearly identifiable is that disasters are seen as a way in which climate change is made visible. So this quote comes from Tukulina. Tukulina works on one of the island councils in Tuvalu. And Tukulina set out how we've had the most visible impacts of climate change, or what we have been told to believe is climate change impacts. Our islets out there, there are 2 islets that have been washed away by big storms in the last 5 years. Cyclone Winston was really bad. It hit all our islands, it washed away one of our islands and took away more than half of another islet. So if that's the impact of climate change, that's it. Now, what's interesting, I think, about this quotation is that Cyclone Winston and tropical storms are seen as a way in which climate is made visible, is felt. But there is a degree of skepticism within this quote, which I teased out in the interview, that this is someone working on the ground who is skeptical of some of the government narratives around sea level rise and the future of Tuvalu. Now, the third narrative that I want to explore with you is this idea of climate change and disasters as being a barrier to development. And this, I think, is particularly prominent in Kiribati. So an interview with one government official in 2018 said, in our context, development has a barrier, and that barrier is climate change. So climate change and disasters in Kiribati and development, you know, they cannot really happen without really addressing these impacts first. So it is something we see as embedded within development and as facet of development. And I think this has been a shift in the policy of Kiribati following 2016. So prior to 2016, the government led by Anoti Tong was really focused on climate change. Whereas after 2016, with the election of Tiniti Mau Mau, there has been a shift towards more development-based issues. And we can actually see this in some of the policy documents. So the Kiribati Vision 20 is about Kiribati's development plan 20 years forward. And climate change is discussed under this heading of cross-cutting issues, environment, climate change, and sustainable development. And it sets out how sea level rise and exacerbated natural disasters, such as drought and weather fluctuations, pose significant and direct additional threats to sectors and resources central to human and national development and the provision of basic human needs. So here we see something quite different to disasters and climate change as an existential risk to the threat, an existential threat to the state. Instead, climate change and disasters are presented as an issue to human development, something that is going to inhibit the ability of Kiribati to meet those sustainable development goals. So to kind of reflect on these 3 narratives, and I'd love to welcome questions from the group around this. I think one is the imaginative geographies of islands, right? That long history of how islands have been represented in literature, in science, in militarism, and that islands are depicted, imagined as being on the front line of climate change. Now, that isn't to say that islands aren't vulnerable to issues on climate change and being affected by them. But this perception of the sinking island, a little bit like the kind of lonely polar bear, is so powerful within climate narratives. It often can cloud wider discussion about the complexity of these issues. That these discourses of existential threat are being challenged, are being reimagined, are being thought about in different ways, and how we might look at the intersection between disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, something like land reclamation that is taking place in Tuvalu. How can that deal with a storm surge as well as creating new land for water and food security? And the final point is this kind of wider geopolitics of disasters, so that when the Prime Minister of Tuvalu speaks at COP around environmental issues, tropical cyclones such as Pam are mobilized to justify the need for action. Wonderful. That is all from me. So I'm going to pass back over to Ellen.
Great. Thank you so much, Liam. That was fascinating. And really appreciate both of you drawing attention to sort of the nuances of islandness, not just the challenges of isolation and spatial scale, but also a much more complicated set of vulnerabilities and opportunities. At this point, I will stop recording and we will go to a question and answer period.